The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the trading post, and Josephine Clarke pressed her gloved hand against the dusty window, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Boston to the Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1876, all to marry a man she had never met. And now that she was finally here, in the shadow of the mountains, every instinct screamed at her to climb back inside and beg the driver to turn around. But she could not. Her family's debts had seen to that. Her father's gambling had left them destitute. And when the letter arrived from Samuel Garrett, a successful ranch owner looking for a wife, her mother had wept with relief and her father had signed the agreement before Josephine could even read it through. She was 22 years old, well-educated, and utterly trapped by circumstances beyond her control. The driver opened the door and extended a weathered hand to help her down. Josephine gathered her skirts and stepped into the afternoon sun, blinking against the brightness. The town of Granite Ridge was nothing like Boston. Wooden buildings lined a single dirt road, and mountains rose in every direction, their peaks still dusted with snow despite the summer heat. The air smelled of pine and horse and something wild she could not name. A few men loitered outside the saloon across the street, watching her with open curiosity. She lifted her chin and tried to look confident, though her legs trembled beneath her traveling dress. "Miss Clarke?" a voice called from behind her, smooth and pleasant. She turned to see a man approaching, and her breath caught. Then he was handsome in a polished way, with dark hair slicked back, a trimmed mustache, and clothes that would not have looked out of place in a Boston drawing room. His smile was easy, charming even. "I am Samuel Garrett. Welcome to Wyoming." Josephine curtsied slightly, old habits rising despite the strange circumstances. "Mr. Garrett, thank you for meeting me. Please call me Samuel." He took her hand and kissed it, his lips barely brushing her glove. "I trust your journey was not too difficult?" "It was long, but I managed." She tried to return his smile, searching his face for some sign of the man she would spend her life with. He was older than she expected, perhaps nearing 40, but there was nothing cruel in his features. Perhaps this arrangement would not be so terrible after all. "Let me collect your trunk, and I will take you to the ranch. We have much to discuss, and I am certain you are exhausted." Samuel gestured to the driver, who was already hauling her heavy trunk from the back of the coach. As he moved to help, Josephine noticed another man standing in the shadow of the trading post entrance, and her breath stopped altogether. He was enormous, easily a head taller than Samuel and twice as broad, with shoulders that strained against his buckskin shirt. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar in waves that looked like they had never seen a proper barber. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but she could see the strong line of his jaw beneath it, and his eyes, piercing blue even from this distance, were fixed directly on her. He did not smile or move or acknowledge Samuel's presence. Mocked, he simply watched her with an intensity that made her skin flush hot despite the mountain breeze. "That is my brother Caleb," Samuel said, following her gaze. There was something in his tone, a tightness she could not quite identify. "He lives up in the mountains, trapping mostly. Comes into town for supplies now and then. Caleb, come meet Miss Clarke." The big man did not move for a long moment, and Josephine thought he might simply ignore the introduction altogether. Then he stepped forward into the sunlight, and she could see him properly. His face was all hard angles and sun-weathered skin, his nose slightly crooked as if it had been broken once or twice. His hands were huge, scarred and calloused, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough like gravel. "Ma'am." "Mr. Garrett," she managed, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. Something about him made her feel like a rabbit facing a wolf, though she could not say whether it was fear or something else entirely. "Just Caleb." His eyes held hers for another heartbeat, then flicked to Samuel. "You did not say she was arriving today." "Did I not? I must have forgotten to mention it when I saw you last week." Samuel's smile never wavered, but Josephine sensed tension crackling between the brothers like heat lightning. "We should be going. The ranch is an hour's ride, and I want Miss Clarke settled before dark." Caleb's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his beard. He looked at Josephine again, something raw and almost desperate in his expression, then turned and walked away without another word. his long strides carrying him toward a massive chestnut horse tied near the trading post. Josephine watched him go, her heart still racing for reasons she did not understand. She had known Samuel Garrett's name for 3 months, had agreed to marry him, had crossed a continent to reach him. But in the space of 30 seconds, his brother had shaken something loose inside her that she had thought long buried beneath duty and propriety. "Do not mind Caleb," Samuel said, guiding her toward a well-maintained wagon. "He is not accustomed to polite company. Mountain life makes men rough." "He seemed perfectly polite to me," Josephine heard herself say, and immediately regretted it when Samuel's smile tightened. "Come, I'm eager to show you your new home." The ride to the Garrett Ranch was indeed an hour, following a rutted road that climbed gradually into the foothills. Samuel talked most of the way, explaining the operation of the ranch, the number of cattle they ran, the quality of the grazing land. Josephine tried to listen, but her mind kept drifting back to those piercing blue eyes and the way Caleb Garrett had looked at her like she was something precious and unattainable all at once. She forced herself to focus on Samuel, on the reality of her situation. He was her betrothed. Caleb was simply a mountain man who happened to be his brother. Whatever she had felt in that moment was nothing more than the strangeness of arriving in an alien place. The ranch was larger and more impressive than she had imagined. A solid log house with a wide porch dominated the cleared land, surrounded by corrals, barns, and outbuildings. Cattle dotted the hillsides beyond, brown and white shapes against the green grass. Samuel helped her down from the wagon and led her inside, where a woman with gray hair and a kind face greeted them. "This is Mrs. Henderson, my housekeeper and cook," Samuel explained. "She will show you to your room. I thought we might have supper together this evening, and tomorrow we can discuss the wedding arrangements. I've already spoken with the circuit preacher. He will be through in 2 weeks." 2 weeks. The words hit Josephine like a physical blow. She had known this was coming, had agreed to it, but hearing the timeline stated so plainly made it terrifyingly real. "That sounds reasonable," she said, because what else could she say? Mrs. Henderson showed her upstairs to a pleasant room with a window overlooking the mountains. "I will bring hot water for a bath," the older woman said. "You must be worn to the bone after all that traveling." "Thank you. You are very kind." Josephine sank onto the bed after Mrs. Henderson left, suddenly so exhausted she could barely hold her head up. But even as she closed her eyes, all she could see was Caleb Garrett's face and the way he had looked at her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his entire life. The next 2 days passed in a blur of domestic routines. Samuel was attentive and courteous, showing her around the ranch, introducing her to the handful of men who worked for him. He never pressed her for more than polite conversation, never touched her beyond offering his arm when they walked. Josephine told herself she was grateful for his restraint, but truthfully, she felt nothing when he was near. No spark, no quickening of her pulse. Just a kind of numb acceptance that this was her future now. On the 3rd morning, she woke early and could not fall back asleep. The sky outside her window was just beginning to lighten, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. She dressed quietly and slipped downstairs, thinking a walk in the cool morning air might settle her restless thoughts. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. She let herself out the front door and stood on the porch, breathing deep. The land stretched out before her, wild and beautiful and utterly foreign. She walked down the steps and across the yard, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. A path led away from the main buildings toward a creek she could hear but not see. She followed it without really thinking, drawn by the sound of running water. She found the creek in a grove of cottonwood trees, the water clear and cold, tumbling over smooth stones. The rising sun filtered through the leaves, dappling everything in gold and green. Josephine sat on a flat rock near the bank and let herself simply be still for the first time since leaving Boston. Out here, with no one watching, she could admit the truth. She was terrified. Terrified of marrying a stranger, of spending her life in this vast, empty place, of never feeling the kind of love she had read about in novels and seen in the faces of her few happily married friends. "You should not be out here alone." Josephine gasped and spun around, nearly slipping off the rock. Caleb Garrett stood at the edge of the grove, his horse grazing behind him. Though in the soft morning light he looked even larger than before, and impossibly out of place among the delicate trees. "You startled me," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "I apologize." He did not move closer, just stood there watching her with that same intense gaze. "There are bears in these woods. Wolves. You should not wander off alone." I did not wander far. The ranch is just beyond those trees. But even as she said it, she realized she could not see the buildings from here, and a small shiver of fear ran through her. "I could not sleep." Caleb nodded slowly, as if he understood more than she had said. He stepped closer, moving with a quiet grace, surprising in such a large man. "May I sit?" Josephine hesitated, knowing she should say no, should return to the house before anyone noticed she was gone. But she found herself nodding, and Caleb lowered himself onto another rock a few feet away. This close, she could see the scars on his hands more clearly, the evidence of a hard life lived outdoors. His clothes were worn but clean, his buckskin shirt laced across his broad chest. He smelled like pine smoke and leather and something wild she still could not name. "You do not want to marry Samuel," he said quietly, and it was not a question. Josephine stiffened. "That is not a proper thing to say." "No, I suppose it is not." Caleb looked at the water, his jaw tight. "But it is true all the same." She should have denied it, should have defended Samuel in her decision, but the words would not come. Instead, she found herself saying, "What choice do I have? My family has nothing. Samuel offered a way out, and I took it. There are always choices." Caleb turned to look at her again, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her breath catch. "You could choose not to marry him." "And what would I do instead? I have no money, no skills beyond needlework and managing a household. I would end up in a brothel or starving in the streets." The bitterness in her own voice surprised her. "You could marry someone else." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Josephine's heart began to pound. "I do not know anyone else. You know me." Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "I know this is sudden. I know you must think I am mad. But I saw you step off that stagecoach, and something inside me knew. You were not meant for Samuel. You were meant for me." She should have laughed or stood up and walked away or done anything except sit there staring at him, but she could not move. Because somewhere deep inside, some part of her that she had tried to ignore and bury and deny was whispering that he was right. "You do not even know me," she whispered. "I know you are brave. You traveled halfway across the country to marry a stranger because your family needed you. I know you are strong, or that journey would have broken you. I know you feel something when you look at me, the same thing I feel when I look at you." His voice dropped lower, rough and urgent. "Tell me I am wrong, and I will walk away right now. I will never speak of this again." Josephine opened her mouth to tell him exactly that, to say he was wrong and presumptuous and completely out of line. But the lie would not come. "I am engaged to your brother," she said instead, and it sounded like the protest it was. "Samuel does not love you. He wants a wife because it is expected of him, because the ranch needs a woman's touch. He chose you from a catalog like ordering supplies from town." Caleb's hands tightened together, his knuckles white. "I know my brother. He will treat you well enough, but you will never be more than a duty to him. Is that what you want? Is that enough?" "What you are suggesting is impossible," Josephine said, but her voice shook. "Samuel expects to marry me. There is a contract. My father has already spent some of the money Samuel sent. I will pay him double what Samuel offered, triple if that is what it takes." Caleb stood abruptly and paced a few steps away, running a hand through his long hair. "I have money saved from years of trapping. I have land up in the mountains, a cabin I built with my own hands. It is not much compared to the ranch, but it is mine, and I could give you a good life there. You are asking me to abandon my agreement, to humiliate your brother, to run away with a man I met 3 days ago." But even as she listed the reasons it was insane, Josephine could feel something crumbling inside her, the walls she had built around herself since her father's debts destroyed their family. "I am asking you to choose your own life instead of the one circumstances forced on you." Caleb turned back to her, and the naked hope in his face nearly undid her completely. "I am asking you to take a chance on something real." Tears stung Josephine's eyes. "How can you possibly know what we have is real? You do not know anything about me beyond what you have imagined." "Then tell me. Tell me everything, and let me prove I am right." He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his large frame. "Please, Josephine, just give me a chance." The sound of her name on his lips, spoken in that rough, desperate voice, broke something open inside her chest. She stood up, intending to walk away to return to the house and her duty and the safe, numb future she had accepted. But instead, she found herself looking up at Caleb Garrett, at this wild mountain man who had looked at her like she was something precious, and heard herself say, "What do you want to know?" They talked as the sun rose higher, bathing the grove in warm light. Josephine told him about Boston, about her childhood in a fine house with servants and parties, about watching it all crumble when her father's gambling debts came due. She told him about her mother's tears and her father's shame, about the letter from Samuel and the relief on her parents' faces when she agreed. She told him things she had never told anyone, secrets and fears and dreams she had thought long dead. Caleb listened to all of it, his blue eyes never leaving her face. When she finally fell silent, he told her his own story. How he and Samuel had grown up on a farm in Missouri, how their parents died of fever when Caleb was 16, how Samuel had taken over the farm and eventually sold it to buy land out west, how Caleb had never fit into civilized life, had always felt more at home in the wilderness than in town, how he had taken to the mountains and never really come back down. "Samuel and I have not been close in years," Caleb admitted. "He thinks I am wasting my life, that I should settle down and help him run the ranch. But I cannot live that way, tied to one place, following rules that never made sense to me. The mountains are where I belong." "Then why do you want a wife at all?" Josephine asked. "I would only tie you down more than the ranch would." "No," Caleb shook his head firmly. "You would be choosing to be there, choosing me. That is different than being trapped by obligation. And I think you would love it up there once you got used to it. The cabin sits in a valley with a view of 3 peaks. There's a meadow where elk graze in the evenings and a hot spring where we can bathe even in winter. It is quiet and wild and free." His voice softened. "I think you need freedom more than anything else right now." He was right, and that terrified her. Josephine stood abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. "I need to think. This is all happening too fast." "I understand." Caleb stood as well, though he made no move to touch her. "But Josephine, you do not have much time. Samuel plans to marry you in less than 2 weeks. If you are going to choose differently, it has to be soon." "I know." She could not look at him, afraid of what she would see in his eyes, more afraid of what he would see in hers. "I should get back before someone notices I am gone. I will walk you back to the edge of the trees." Caleb moved to his horse and took the reins, leading the animal as they walked. They did not speak, but the silence was heavy with everything unsaid. At the edge of the grove, where she could see the ranch buildings in the distance, Caleb stopped. "Whatever you decide, I will respect it, but please, decide for yourself, not for your parents or Samuel or anyone else, just you." Josephine nodded, not trusting her voice, and hurried back toward the house. She did not look back, though she could feel his gaze on her until she disappeared inside. The rest of the day was torture. Samuel took her into town to meet the preacher and discuss the ceremony, and Josephine smiled and nodded and said all the right things while her mind screamed. That night, lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling and tried to weigh her options rationally. Marriage to Samuel meant security, a comfortable home, social respectability. She would want for nothing material, and he seemed kind enough. If she never felt passion or deep love, well, most women did not. She would manage, just as countless women before her had managed. But then she thought of Caleb, of the way he had looked at her, the way her whole body had come alive in his presence. She thought of his offer of freedom and wildness and a life chosen rather than accepted. It was insane. It was reckless. It was everything she had been taught never to do. It was exactly what she wanted. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, and pressed her hands to her face. She wanted to go with Caleb. She wanted to abandon duty and propriety and the suffocating weight of expectation and run away to the mountains with a man she barely knew. The very idea was madness, but it was also the first thing that had felt true since her father had told her they were destitute. But wanting something and doing it were two very different things. If she left with Caleb, Samuel would be humiliated. The whole territory would know she had jilted him for his own brother. Her reputation would be destroyed, and Samuel's along with it. He might refuse to release her from the contract, might demand her father return the money he had already spent. And what if Caleb was wrong? What if this feeling between them was nothing more than attraction and the appeal of the forbidden? What if she went with him and discovered too late that she had made a terrible mistake? Josephine barely slept that night, and when she came down to breakfast, she must have looked as exhausted as she felt because Mrs. Henderson clucked over her and insisted she rest. Samuel had business in the north pasture that would keep him away most of the day, so Josephine retreated to the porch with a book she did not read. Her mind kept circling back to the same impossible question. Stay or go? Duty or desire? Safety or freedom? She did not hear the horse approach until it was nearly at the porch steps. She looked up and her heart leaped. Caleb sat astride his big chestnut, a leather pack tied behind his saddle. He dismounted and walked toward her, and even from a distance she could see the tension in his shoulders. I know I should not be here, he said without preamble, but I could not stay away. I had to know. Have you made a decision? Josephine stood, her book falling unheeded to the porch floor. Caleb, this is complicated. It is simple. Do you want to marry Samuel, or do you want to come with me? His blue eyes burned with intensity. Everything else we can figure out together. Samuel will hate you. Your relationship with your brother is already strained. This would destroy what little is left. She stepped closer to the edge of the porch, gripping the railing. And what about my family? They need the money Samuel promised. I told you, I will send them more than Samuel would have. They will be better off than before. Caleb moved to the bottom of the steps, looking up at her. And Samuel, he will be angry, but he will recover. His pride will be hurt, but not his heart. He does not love you, Josephine. He might not even be capable of it. But I am. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Josephine's eyes filled with tears. You cannot possibly love me. You do not know me. I know enough. Caleb climbed 2 steps, bringing them nearly eye to eye despite the difference in their heights. I know that when I saw you, something inside me recognized you. Like you were the missing piece I did not even know I was looking for. Tell me you do not feel it too. Of course I feel it, Josephine whispered, the tears spilling over now. But feeling something does not make it right. It does not make it wise. When has love ever been wise? Caleb reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His hand was rough and warm, and the gentleness of the gesture undid her completely. Come with me, Josephine. Take a chance on this. On us. She looked into his eyes and saw her future there. Not the safe, predictable future she had resigned herself to, but something wild and uncertain and utterly alive. And she realized that if she married Samuel, she would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. She would look at Caleb across the supper table at holiday gatherings and feel this same ache, this same longing, until it consumed her. Yes, she heard herself say, and the words seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, from a place that still believed in possibility. Yes, I will go with you. The transformation on Caleb's face was extraordinary. Joy and relief and something fiercer flooded his features, and he pulled her into his arms before she could take another breath. Josephine gasped at the solid feel of him, the sheer size and strength of him, but then his hand came up to cradle the back of her head, gentle despite his obvious power, and she melted against him. He was so warm, so solid, so real. We need to leave now, Caleb said, his voice rough against her hair, before Samuel comes back. Reality crashed back in. I need to pack. I need to write a letter. I cannot just disappear without a word. You can pack quickly. Bring only what you need. I have supplies at my cabin. Caleb pulled back enough to look at her, his hands on her shoulders. And yes, you should leave a letter. But Josephine, If we are still here when Samuel returns, this gets much more complicated. He will try to talk you out of it, and if that does not work, he might try to force the issue. I do not want it to come to that." She had not considered that Samuel might refuse to let her go, but of course he would. His pride, if nothing else, would demand he fight for her. "Give me 10 minutes, she said, and rushed inside. Packing was a frantic blur. She grabbed her warmest clothes, a few personal items, the small amount of money she still had. Her hands shook as she wrote the letter to Samuel, trying to explain the unexplainable. She told him she was sorry, that she had not meant for this to happen, that she could not marry him when her heart belonged to someone else. She promised he would receive triple the amount he had sent her family, and she begged him not to hate Caleb, though she knew that was probably impossible. She left the letter on her bed and took one last look around the room that was supposed to have been hers, then grabbed her bag and ran back downstairs. Mrs. Henderson was in the kitchen, and her eyes went wide when she saw Josephine with her bag. "Miss Clarke, what are you doing?" "I am leaving," Josephine said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Please give Mr. Garrett my apologies and tell him there is a letter upstairs, and thank you for your kindness. I'm sorry to leave this way." Before the housekeeper could respond, Josephine hurried out to the porch where Caleb waited, his horse ready. He tied her bag behind his saddle, then turned to her. "Can you ride?" "Not well," she admitted. "I've only ridden in parks, never like this." "Then you will ride with me." Caleb mounted in one smooth motion, then extended his hand. "Put your foot on mine and let me pull you up." Josephine hesitated for only a second, then did as he said. His strength was astonishing. Then he lifted her like she weighed nothing and settled her in front of him on the saddle. She had never sat astride in her life, and her skirts were completely inappropriate for it, but there was no time to worry about propriety. Caleb's arm came around her waist, solid and secure, and he kicked the horse into motion. They rode fast, leaving the ranch behind. Josephine clung to the saddle horn, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had done it. She had actually done it. She had abandoned her engagement, her duty, her entire plan, and run off with a mountain man she had known less than a week. It was the most reckless thing she had ever done, and she could not bring herself to regret it. They rode for hours, climbing higher into the mountains on trails Josephine would never have seen on her own. Caleb guided the horse with easy confidence, his body moving with the animal's gait. Pressed against his broad chest, feeling the play of muscles as he controlled their mount, Josephine felt safer than she had in months, despite the fact that she was fleeing into unknown wilderness with a man who was practically a stranger. The sun was well past its peak when Caleb finally slowed the horse near a small stream. "We will rest here and let the horse drink," he said, his voice rumbling against her back. "Are you all right?" "I think so." Josephine's legs were cramped from the unfamiliar position, and her lower back ached, but she was unhurt. Caleb dismounted first, then helped her down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, and his hand steadied her. "It will take some getting used to," he said gently. "We have another few hours of riding before we reach the cabin. Can you manage?" "I will manage." Josephine straightened, determined not to be a burden. She had made this choice, and she would see it through. Caleb's expression softened, and he lifted a hand to brush a strand of hair from her face. "You are remarkable. You know that?" The tenderness in his voice, in his touch, made her throat tight. "I am terrified," she admitted. "What if Samuel comes after us? What if I cannot adjust to mountain life? What if we have made a terrible mistake?" "Then we will figure it out together." Caleb cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. "But Josephine, I do not think this is a mistake. I think this is the first truly right thing either of us has done in a long time." She wanted to believe him, needed to believe him. Kiss me," she whispered, surprising herself. "Please, I need to know this is real." Caleb went very still, his blue eyes searching hers. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and brushed his lips against hers. It was gentle at first, almost questioning, but when Josephine made a soft sound and pressed closer, his arms came around her and the kiss deepened. He tasted like coffee and something wild, and his beard was surprisingly soft against her skin. Heat flooded through her, pooling low in her belly, and she clutched at his shirt, needing to be closer, needing more. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. Real enough for you? He asked, his voice rough with desire. Yes, Josephine breathed. Very real. They remounted and continued their journey. The trail grew steeper and more narrow, winding between towering pines. Josephine saw wildlife she had only read about in books, a deer that bounded away at their approach, an eagle circling high overhead, and once, in the distance, what Caleb said was a black bear. The world felt huge and wild and more alive than anything she had known in Boston. The sun was beginning to set when they crested a ridge, and Caleb said, "There, that is home." Josephine looked where he pointed and caught her breath. A valley opened below them, green and lush, with a creek running through its center. At the far end, backed against the mountain slope, was a log cabin. It was small but solidly built, with a covered porch and smoke rising from the chimney. Beyond it, 3 mountain peaks rose against the sky, on their summits still crowned with snow despite the summer warmth. "It is beautiful," Josephine said, and meant it. There was something about the isolation, the wildness of it, that called to something deep inside her. "Come on, let me show you properly." Caleb guided the horse down into the valley. As they approached, Josephine could see more details. A small barn and corral stood to one side, with a few chickens pecking in the yard. A vegetable garden grew near the house, neat rows of green. Fur pelts were stretched on frames near the barn, drying in the air. It was rustic and rough, but there was an order to it, a sense that this was a place someone cared for. Caleb helped her down and tied the horse at the corral fence. "I will tend to the horse and show you inside. Are you hungry?" "I have stew on the stove. Keeping warm." "Starving," Josephine admitted. She had been too nervous to eat breakfast, and they had not stopped for a meal on the ride. Caleb led her inside, and Josephine looked around with curious eyes. The cabin was a single large room with a loft above, accessed by a ladder. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cookstove beside it. The furniture was simple but well made. A table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, a bed in one corner with a colorful quilt. Shelves held supplies and a few books. It was spare compared to what she was used to, but it was clean and warm, and she could imagine being happy here. "I know it is not much," Caleb said, watching her face anxiously, "but I can add on as we need. Maybe a separate bedroom, or a room for children. If we are blessed with them." The idea of children, of a future here with Caleb, made Josephine's heart stutter, but she pushed the thought aside for now. There was too much to process already. "It is perfect," she said, "truly." Relief flooded Caleb's features. He ladled stew into 2 bowls, and they sat at the table. The food was simple but good, and Josephine ate ravenously. As she ate, exhaustion crept over her. The emotional turmoil of the past days, the long ride, all of it hit her at once, and she could barely keep her eyes open. "You need to sleep," Caleb said gently when she swayed in her chair. "Take the bed. I will sleep on the floor tonight." "You do not have to do that. This is your home." But even as she protested, Josephine knew she could not stay awake much longer. "Josephine, we are not married yet. I will not compromise you that way." Caleb stood and guided her to the bed. "Sleep. We can talk more tomorrow, and we can figure out what comes next." She was too tired to argue. She lay down on the bed, not even bothering to remove her dress, and was asleep within minutes. When Josephine woke, sunshine was streaming through the small window, and the cabin was empty. She sat up, momentarily disoriented, then memory flooded back. She had run away with Caleb. She was in his cabin in the mountains, miles from the nearest town, from Samuel, from everything she had known. Panic fluttered in her chest for a moment before she pushed it down. She had made her choice. Now she had to live with it. She rose and found a basin of water on the table, still warm, with a cloth beside it. Caleb must have left it for her. She washed her face and hands, but then ventured outside. The morning was clear and cool, the air so clean it almost hurt to breathe. She found Caleb near the barn, chopping wood. He had removed his shirt, and Josephine froze at the sight of him. His back was a landscape of muscle, his shoulders impossibly broad, his arms thick and corded with strength. Scars crisscrossed his skin, evidence of a life lived hard, but there was a grace to his movements, a controlled power in the way he swung the axe. He must have sensed her watching because he turned, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" "Very well." Josephine walked closer, trying not to stare at his bare chest, at the mat of dark hair that covered his pectorals and arrowed down past the waistband of his pants. Thank you for the water." "Of course." Caleb set down the axe and reached for his shirt, pulling it on. "Are you hungry? I can make breakfast." They ate together, a simple meal of eggs from the chickens and bread Caleb had baked himself. Josephine was impressed despite herself. Samuel had a cook and housekeeper. Caleb did everything himself and did it well. After breakfast, he showed her around the property, pointing out where he trapped in the winter, where the best fishing was, the hot spring he had mentioned. Josephine listened and asked questions, trying to imagine herself living this life. "We need to talk about what comes next," Caleb said finally, as they sat on a flat rock near the creek. "We cannot simply ignore what happened. Samuel will be looking for us, and we need to make this right." "How can we make it right?" "We humiliated him." Josephine picked at the hem of her dress, guilt churning in her stomach. "I will go to him. I will explain and offer him the money I promised for your family, and I will make it clear that this was my doing, not yours." Caleb's jaw was set with determination. "I will not let you take the blame for this. But it was not your doing. I chose to come with you." Josephine looked up at him. "If anyone is to blame, we both are." "Samuel will not see it that way. He will assume I stole you from him, that I used some kind of mountain man magic to bewitch you." There was a trace of humor in Caleb's voice, but his eyes were serious. "And honestly, I do not care what he thinks of me. We have not been close in years. But I do not want this to ruin your reputation entirely. I think my reputation is beyond saving at this point." Josephine tried to keep her voice light, but fear gnawed at her. She had burned every bridge behind her. If things did not work out with Caleb, she would have nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Caleb must have seen the fear in her face because he reached out and took her hand. "Hey, look at me." When she did, his blue eyes were steady and sure. "I am not going to abandon you. Whatever happens with Samuel, whatever the town thinks, you and I are in this together. Do you understand?" "I want to believe that," Josephine whispered. "Then believe it." Caleb raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. "I will go to town tomorrow and settle things with Samuel. But today, I want to show you something." He led her higher up the mountain on a narrow trail that made Josephine's heart pound, more from exertion than fear. They climbed for over an hour before Caleb finally stopped and said, "Close your eyes." "What? Why?" "Just trust me." His voice was warm with amusement. "Close your eyes and let me lead you a little farther." Josephine did as he asked, letting him guide her forward. His hand was large and warm around hers, steady and sure. "All right," he said after a minute, "open them." She opened her eyes and gasped. They stood on an outcropping of rock that jutted out from the mountainside, and the view was breathtaking. The valley spread below them, green and perfect, with Caleb's cabin a tiny structure in the distance. Beyond that, more mountains rolled away in every direction, blue and purple in the afternoon light. The sky seemed impossibly vast, and the world felt both enormous and intimate at once. "I come here when I need to think," Caleb said quietly, "or when I need to remember why I love this place. It makes everything else seem small." "It is magnificent." Josephine could not tear her eyes from the view. She had never seen anything like it, had never imagined such beauty existed. "I wanted you to see it, to understand why I choose this life." Caleb stepped closer, his presence warm at her back. "I know it is hard and lonely sometimes. I know you are giving up a lot to be here. But I think you might come to love it too, given time." Josephine turned to face him, her heart in her throat. They were alone on this mountaintop, miles from anyone. And the look in Caleb's eyes made her feel like the most precious thing in the world. "I think I am already starting to," she admitted. Caleb's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "May I kiss you again?" "Please," Josephine breathed, and this time when his mouth claimed hers, there was nothing gentle about it. The kiss was hungry and desperate, weeks of wanting compressed into a single moment. Josephine pressed against him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and Caleb groaned low in his throat. His arms came around her, lifting her onto her toes, and she could feel the hard planes of his body against her softer curves. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "We should stop," Caleb said roughly. "We should wait until we are properly married." "Then marry me," Josephine said, always surprising herself. "Not in 2 weeks, not after you settle things with Samuel. Now. Today." Caleb stared at her. "Josephine, we cannot. There is no preacher up here, and even if there were, we need to make things right first. We can have a ceremony later for everyone else, but here, now, just us and God and these mountains." Josephine gripped his shirt tighter. "I do not want to wait. I do not want to spend another night wondering if this is real or if I have made a terrible mistake. I want to be yours completely. Please, Caleb." For a long moment he did not move. Then slowly he nodded. "All right? If that is what you want, then yes. We will marry ourselves here and now, before God and these mountains." They stood facing each other on that windswept outcropping, the vast wilderness their only witness. When Caleb took both of Josephine's hands in his blue eyes solemn and full of emotion. "I, Caleb Garrett, take you, Josephine Clarke, to be my wife. I promise to love you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to be faithful, to provide for you, and to build a life with you here in these mountains. From this day forward, you are mine, and I am yours." Tears streamed down Josephine's face as she repeated the vows back to him, her voice steady despite her emotion. "I, Josephine Clarke, take you, Caleb Garrett, to be my husband. I promise to love you, honor you, and stand beside you for all the days of my life. I promise to be faithful, to build a home with you, and to embrace this new life. From this day forward, you are mine, and I am yours." Caleb slid a thin leather cord from his wrist and tied it gently around Josephine's, knotting it securely. "Until I can get you a proper ring," he said quietly. "It is perfect." Josephine looked down at the simple cord, then back up at Caleb. "Are we married now?" "In every way that matters to me." Caleb pulled her close and kissed her again, sealing their vows. Josephine clung to him, feeling something settle deep inside her chest. She was married. To a mountain man she barely knew, in a ceremony no church would recognize, on a mountaintop miles from civilization. And it felt more right than anything she had ever done. They made their way back down to the cabin as the sun began to set, and this time, when they reached the door, Caleb swept Josephine up in his arms and carried her over the threshold. She laughed. "I'm delighted," and he grinned at her. "Tradition," he said, setting her down gently. That night, they truly became husband and wife in every sense. Caleb was gentle despite his size and strength, taking his time, making sure Josephine felt nothing but pleasure. Afterward, lying in his arms in the narrow bed, Josephine felt a peace she had not known in years. The future was uncertain, and they still had to face Samuel and the consequences of their choices. But for this moment, she was exactly where she wanted to be. The next morning, Caleb rose early and dressed in his cleanest clothes. "I'm riding to the ranch," he told Josephine over breakfast. "I need to face Samuel and settle this properly. It might take most of the day." "I want to come with you." Josephine set down her coffee cup, her stomach churning with anxiety. No," Caleb's tone was firm. "Samuel will be angry, and I do not want you there for that. Let me handle him. He deserves to hear from me, too. I am the one who broke our agreement." Josephine stood, moving to stand in front of Caleb. "I will not hide while you face this alone." They argued for several minutes before Caleb finally relented, though he was clearly unhappy about it. They saddled the horse and rode together back down the mountain trails. Josephine's stomach was in knots by the time the ranch came into view. What would Samuel say? Would he try to force her to stay? Would he refuse to let her go? They found Samuel on the porch, and his face went through several emotions when he saw them: surprise, anger, hurt, and finally a cold fury that made Josephine's blood run cold. "So it is true," he said, his voice clipped. "Mrs. Henderson told me she saw you riding off with my brother, but I hoped she was mistaken." "Samuel, I am sorry," Josephine began, but he held up a hand. "Do not. Whatever you have to say, I do not want to hear it." He turned his gaze to Caleb. I should have known. You have always resented me, always wanted what I had. Now you take my bride?" "She was never truly yours," Caleb said quietly, "and I did not take her. She chose to come with me." "Because you filled her head with romantic nonsense about mountain life." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. "She does not know what she's getting into. She's a city woman, used to comfort in society. You will destroy her with your rough living." "That is for Josephine to decide, not you." Caleb's voice remained calm, but Josephine could see the tension in his shoulders. Or Samuel turned to her, and the hurt in his eyes made her flinch. "Is this truly what you want? To throw away a good life for my bastard brother and his cabin in the woods?" "Yes," Josephine said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I am sorry, Samuel. Truly, you did not deserve this, but I cannot marry you when I have feelings for Caleb. It would not be fair to either of us." "Feelings," Samuel spat the word like a curse. "You have known him less than a week. Whatever you think you feel, it will pass once reality sets in." "Maybe," Josephine admitted, "but I need to find out for myself, and I am asking you please to let me go. Release me from our agreement, and I swear you will be compensated for your trouble." "I do not want compensation. I want a wife." But even as Samuel said it, Josephine could hear the resignation creeping into his voice. He knew he had lost. "Fine. Go. Marry him if that is what you want, but do not come crying to me when you realize what a mistake you have made." "I will send triple the amount I promised to your family," Caleb said, pulling a leather pouch from his pocket. "And here is payment for the trouble we have caused you. It is not enough, I know, but it is all I have right now." Samuel stared at the pouch, but did not take it. "Keep your money. Just go, both of you. I do not want to see either of you again." There was nothing more to say. Caleb and Josephine mounted the horse and rode away, and Josephine did not look back. She felt Samuel's gaze on them until they crested the ridge, but she kept her eyes forward on the mountains ahead. They stopped at the trading post in Granite Ridge, and Caleb arranged for a large sum of money to be wired to Josephine's parents in Boston, enough to pay off their debts and more. Then he found the circuit preacher and arranged for a proper ceremony the following week. "I want you to have a real wedding," he told Josephine, "with witnesses and a certificate that makes it legal. Our ceremony on the mountain was for us, but this one will be for the world." The preacher agreed, though he raised his eyebrows when he heard about the broken engagement. "There will be talk," he warned. "Let them talk," Caleb said firmly. "We know the truth of it." They were married a week later in the small church in Granite Ridge, with Mrs. Henderson and a few townspeople as witnesses. But Josephine wore a simple dress she had made herself from fabric Caleb bought at the trading post, and Caleb wore his best buckskins. It was nothing like the grand ceremony that had been planned with Samuel, but it was perfect. Afterward, they celebrated with a meal at the hotel, and several people came by to offer cautious congratulations. The town was small, and everyone knew the whole scandalous story, but most seemed willing to give them a chance. They returned to the cabin, and over the following weeks, Josephine began to learn the rhythms of mountain life. Caleb taught her to shoot, how to identify edible plants, how to fish in the cold streams. She tended the garden and the chickens, learning domestic skills her mother would never have imagined her needing. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done in Boston, but there was a satisfaction to it. She could see the direct results of her labor, vegetables growing, bread rising, pelts drying. And every evening, Caleb would come in from whatever work he had been doing, and his face would light up when he saw her, and Josephine knew she had made the right choice. Not everything was easy. There were days when Josephine missed her old life, when the isolation felt crushing, and she longed for conversation with someone other than her husband. There were nights when the wind howled around the cabin, and she was certain bears or wolves or mountain lions were about to break down the door. There were moments when she wondered if Samuel had been right, if she had made a terrible mistake. But then Caleb would pull her close, his strong arms making her feel safe, and he would tell her stories about the mountains, or they would sit together watching the sunset, paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, and the doubts would fade. He was endlessly patient with her struggles, never mocking or dismissing her fears. When she burned supper, he ate it without complaint. When she ruined a batch of bread, he showed her gently what she had done wrong. When she wept from homesickness, he held her and let her cry, and never once suggested she had been wrong to choose this life. Summer turned to autumn, and the aspens in the valley turned brilliant gold. Caleb began preparing for winter, stocking the cabin with supplies, hunting game to preserve, cutting enough firewood to last through the cold months. Josephine helped as much as she could, learning to preserve meat, to make candles from tallow, to prepare for the long isolation winter would bring. It was in late October when Josephine first suspected she might be pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses twice, and her breasts were tender. She said nothing to Caleb at first, wanting to be sure, but when she missed a third time and began feeling nauseous in the mornings, she could not keep it to herself any longer. She told him one evening after supper, her hands trembling as she formed the words. "Caleb, I think I am with child." He went very still, his blue eyes searching her face. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor. All the signs are there." She bit her lips, suddenly terrified. What if he was not ready for this? What if a child was too much, too soon? But then a slow, wondering smile spread across Caleb's face, and he crossed to her in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms. "A child," he breathed. "We are going to have a child." Relief flooded through Josephine, and she clung to him. "You are happy?" "Happy? I'm overjoyed." Caleb pulled back enough to look at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You have given me so much, Josephine. A wife, a true home, and now a child. I never thought I would have any of this." They held each other for a long time, and Josephine felt a deep contentment settle over her. This was her family now. This rough mountain man and the child growing inside her. It was not the life she had planned, but it was the life she wanted. Winter came early and hard that year. Snow fell in November and did not stop until the valley was buried beneath several feet of white. The cabin became their entire world, and Josephine discovered the truth of isolation. There were days when she did not see another soul besides Caleb, when the howling wind made her feel like they were the only people left on earth. But there were also long evenings by the fire, with Caleb reading aloud from his small collection of books or teaching her to play checkers with pieces he carved from wood. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their childhoods, dreams for the future, fears and hopes, and the 1,000 small things that made up a life together. Josephine's pregnancy progressed, her belly growing round. Caleb was fiercely protective, barely letting her lift anything heavy, insisting she rest whenever she looked tired. He built a cradle from pine wood, smoothing it until it was soft as silk. Waya and Josephine sewed tiny gowns from fabric they had brought from town before the snows came. When spring finally arrived and the snows began to melt, Caleb made the journey to town and returned with a midwife, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Owens, who agreed to stay with them until the baby came. Josephine was grateful for the female company after months of isolation. Mrs. Owens was gruff but kind, and she answered all of Josephine's nervous questions about the birth. The baby came in late May, after a labor that lasted most of a day and left Josephine exhausted and shaking. But when Mrs. Owens placed the squalling infant in her arms, all the pain disappeared. He was perfect. A son with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. They named him Daniel, after Caleb's father. Caleb held his son with a gentleness that seemed impossible in such large, rough hands, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered to Josephine. "Thank you for this gift." That summer was one of the happiest of Josephine's life. She learned to be a mother while Daniel thrived, growing chubby and healthy on her milk. Caleb was an attentive father, always ready to walk the baby when he was fussy, to sing to him in his rough voice, to simply hold him and marvel at the miracle they had created. The cabin rang with Daniel's laughter, and Josephine could not imagine being anywhere else. In late summer, they made the journey to town for supplies, and Josephine steeled herself for the reactions they might face. But to her surprise, most people were kind. They admired Daniel and offered congratulations. And while there were still some who turned away or whispered behind their hands, it was clear that the scandal of their marriage had largely faded. They were simply another family now, making a life in the wilderness. They even saw Samuel once, outside the trading post. He looked older, harder, and when his eyes met Josephine's, there was no warmth in them, but he nodded curtly and walked on. and Josephine took it as a sign that he had moved forward with his life. She hoped he would find happiness, though she knew the rift between the brothers might never fully heal. As Daniel grew from infant to toddler, Josephine discovered depths of strength and capability she had never known she possessed. She learned to manage the household through all seasons, to help with the heavier work when Caleb was away trapping, and to make do with what they had and be content. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Granite Ridge, terrified and trapped by duty, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more confident, more alive. 3 years after Daniel's birth, a daughter joined the family. They named her Sarah, and she had her mother's dark curls and delicate features. Caleb doted on her shamelessly, carrying her everywhere, teaching her the names of birds and trees before she could even walk properly. Daniel, now a sturdy toddler, was protective of his little sister, and the cabin that had once seemed so small now felt full of love and laughter. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Caleb took Josephine back to the mountaintop where they had married themselves. They stood on the same outcropping, looking out over the valley that had become their home, and Caleb pulled her close. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing this life?" Josephine looked up at him, at the man who had given her freedom and love and a life more real than anything she had known before. "Not for a single moment," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. "This is exactly where I am meant to be." Caleb kissed her then, deep and loving, and Josephine felt the same spark she had felt that first day, standing in the shadow of the trading post. Some things, she had learned, did not fade with time. Some things only grew stronger. They added onto the cabin over the years, building a separate bedroom for the children and expanding the main room. Caleb taught Daniel to hunt and fish, and Josephine taught Sarah to read and sew. The family made the journey to town a few times each year, and gradually became more accepted in the community. Josephine even made friends with a few of the other women, ranch wives and townspeople, who admired her courage in choosing such an unconventional life. When Daniel was 10 and Sarah was 7, a third child arrived, another son they named Thomas. By then, Josephine could hardly remember the frightened young woman who had agreed to marry a stranger out of duty. That life felt like something from a story, something that had happened to someone else. Her real life had begun the day Caleb Garrett looked at her across the dusty street in Granite Ridge and saw not a mail-order bride, but the other half of his soul. There were still hard times. One winter, a sickness swept through and Thomas became dangerously ill. And Josephine spent 3 terrifying days nursing him while Caleb rode through a blizzard to fetch the doctor. He recovered, but the fear of losing him never fully left either parent. Another year, a late freeze killed most of their garden, and they had to rely heavily on hunting to get through the winter. And always, there was the backbreaking work of mountain life, the constant struggle against weather and wildlife and isolation. But there were far more good times than bad. Summer evenings sitting on the porch while the children played in the meadow and elk grazed in the distance. Winter nights gathered around the fire, warm and safe while snow piled up outside. The pride on Caleb's face when Daniel shot his first deer. The sound of Sarah's laughter echoing through the valley, the weight of Thomas asleep in Josephine's arms. These were the moments that made up a life, that transformed a cabin in the wilderness into a home. Josephine never saw Samuel again after that one brief encounter in town. She heard through the gossip that filtered up from the valley that he eventually married a widow from a neighboring ranch, a practical arrangement that suited them both. She hoped it was true, hoped he had found some measure of contentment. The guilt she had carried for breaking their engagement had faded with time, replaced by the certainty that she had done the right thing for both of them. Samuel had deserved a woman who could love him, and she had deserved to marry for love rather than duty. As the years passed and her children grew, Josephine sometimes thought about the path her life might have taken if she had married Samuel as planned. She would have lived in comfort, been respected in the community, never known the grinding work or isolation of mountain life. But she also would never have known the fierce, protective love of a man who cherished her, never experienced the deep satisfaction of building something with her own hands, never felt fully alive in the way she did watching the sunrise paint the mountain peaks outside her window. When Daniel turned 18, The same age Josephine had been when she left Boston, he announced he wanted to join his father full-time in the trapping business. Caleb, now in his late 40s with silver threading through his dark hair and beard, beamed with pride. Sarah had grown into a lovely young woman who shared her mother's intelligence and her father's love of the wilderness. Or she had no interest in moving to town or finding a city life, perfectly content to help her mother run the household and tend the expanded garden that now fed them through the long winters. Thomas, at 15, was still finding his path, but he had his father's size and strength and a gentle heart that made him beloved by his siblings. On a warm summer evening, after supper had been cleared and the children were occupied with their own pursuits, Caleb took Josephine's hand and led her outside. They walked together to the creek, to the grove of cottonwoods, where he had first asked her to choose him over duty and safety. The trees had grown taller in the 20 years since, and the place felt almost sacred now, heavy with memory. "Do you remember the first time we talked here?" Caleb asked, his arm around Josephine's waist. "You were so frightened, sitting on that rock, trying to figure out what to do with your life." "I remember. I thought you were mad for asking me to run away with you." Josephine leaned against his solid warmth, marveling at how natural it still felt after all these years. "Sometimes I still cannot believe I said yes. I'm glad you did. Every single day I'm grateful you took that chance." Caleb turned her to face him, his blue eyes still as piercing as they had been when he was younger, though now framed by laugh lines in the weathering of decades of mountain sun. "You gave me everything, Josephine. A family, a real home, a reason to build something instead of just surviving. You saved me." "You saved me first," Josephine said, reaching up to cup his bearded cheek. "You saw me when I was invisible. You offered me freedom when I thought I would never have any. You loved me when I did not think anyone could." They kissed, tender and familiar, and Josephine felt the same flutter in her chest she had felt that first time on the mountaintop. Some things never changed, never faded. Some, love only grew deeper with time. As they walked back to the cabin, hand in hand, Josephine looked at the life they had built together. The sturdy log walls expanded and improved over the years, the barn with its neat rows of traps and tools, the garden bursting with vegetables, the children, grown and growing, healthy and happy, the mountains standing guard all around, eternal and beautiful. This was her kingdom, rough and wild and utterly perfect. That night, lying in bed with Caleb's arm around her and the sounds of the wilderness outside their window, Josephine thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach so long ago. She wished she could tell that girl not to be afraid, that the path she was about to choose would be difficult but so worth it, that love was worth the risk, that freedom was worth the sacrifice, that building a life with your own hands brought a satisfaction no inherited wealth or social status ever could. But that girl was gone, transformed by years of hard work and deep love in the wild beauty of the mountains. In her place was a woman who knew her own strength, who had faced every challenge the wilderness threw at her and emerged victorious. A woman who had raised 3 children to be strong and kind and capable. A woman who was loved completely by a man who still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. Josephine Clarke Garrett closed her eyes and let sleep take her, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with. The mountain man who had seen her heart and refused to let her marry the wrong man had given her a life beyond anything she could have imagined, and every day, for the rest of her life, she would be grateful that she had been brave enough to take his hand and leap into the unknown. The years continued to pass, bringing new joys and challenges. Daniel married a girl from town, a rancher's daughter who adapted to mountain life with the same determination Josephine had shown decades before. They built their own cabin in a neighboring valley, close enough to visit, but far enough for independence, and soon blessed Caleb and Josephine with grandchildren. Sarah, to everyone's surprise except Josephine's, fell in love with a young doctor who came to Granite Ridge to set up practice, and together they opened a clinic that served the scattered mountain communities. Thomas eventually decided he wanted to learn the cattle business and apprenticed himself to a rancher on the other side of the territory. But he returned home regularly, always with stories of his adventures and a hunger for his mother's cooking. Caleb aged gracefully, his strength enduring long past when most men would have slowed down. He still trapped in the winter, though Daniel took over more of the distant lines. And he still chopped wood and hunted and maintained the property with the same steady competence he always had. His hair went fully silver, and his beard grew longer, making him look like some ancient mountain spirit. But his eyes remained sharp and clear, and when he looked at Josephine, there was still the same fierce devotion that had been there from the beginning. Josephine herself felt the years more keenly. Her hands grew gnarled with arthritis, making the delicate work of sewing more difficult. Her dark hair went gray, then white, and her face mapped with lines earned from laughter and worry and decades of mountain sun. But she remained active, tending her garden, cooking for her family, making the journey to town to visit Sarah and her grandchildren when the weather permitted. On their 30th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the cabin for a celebration. The small building could barely contain them all, and the noise and chaos reminded Josephine of her childhood in Boston, when her mother would host parties that filled their house with light and laughter. But this was better, because these people were hers, born of her love for Caleb and his for her. That evening, after everyone had eaten and the grandchildren were asleep in various corners of the cabin, Daniel stood and raised his glass. "To my parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "who taught us that love is worth fighting for, that a life built with your own hands is more valuable than anything inherited, and that home is not a place, but the people you choose to build it with. Thank you for showing us what real marriage looks like." Everyone drank to the toast, and Josephine felt tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. She looked at Caleb and saw matching moisture in his eyes. They had done it. Against all odds, despite the scandal and hardship and uncertainty, they had built something lasting and real. A family, a legacy, a love that would outlive them both. Later that night, after their children had taken the grandchildren home and the cabin was quiet again, Caleb led Josephine outside one more time. The summer night was warm and clear, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, more for comfort than warmth, and held her close as they looked out over the valley that had been their home for 3 decades. "No regrets?" he asked, the same question he had asked on their 5th anniversary, and their 10th, and their 20th. "Not a single one," Josephine answered, the same words she had given him every time and would give him for as long as they both lived. "You?" "Only that I did not find you sooner." Caleb kissed the top of her head, his arms tight around her. "But I am grateful for every day we have had." They stood together in the darkness, two people who had taken a wild chance on love and been rewarded beyond measure. The mountains stood silent around them, bearing witness to their happiness as they had from the very beginning. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and another answered, their voices carrying across the wilderness. It was a lonely sound, but standing there in Caleb's arms, Josephine felt anything but alone. This was her life. The one she had chosen, the one she had fought for, the one she had built with love and determination and stubbornness. It had not been easy, but nothing worthwhile ever was. And standing there under the vast Wyoming sky, surrounded by mountains and memories and the deep contentment of a life well lived, Josephine Clarke Garrett knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single thing. She was meant to marry Samuel, according to the contract her father signed and the circumstances that had driven her west. But fate and a mountain man with piercing blue eyes had intervened, and she had ended up exactly where she belonged, in the arms of a man who loved her completely, in a place that had become more home than any mansion in Boston ever could have been, with a family born of passion and choice rather than duty and expectation. The stagecoach that had brought her to Granite Ridge felt like a lifetime ago now, like something from a story about someone else. But Josephine remembered that frightened young woman with clarity and compassion. She had been so lost, so trapped, so resigned to a future without joy. And then Caleb had seen her, had recognized something in her that she had not even known was there, and had offered her a choice: stay safe or leap into the unknown, accept what was expected or fight for what she wanted. She had chosen love. She had chosen freedom. She had chosen life. And that had made all the difference. As they finally turned to go back inside, to the warm cabin and the bed they had shared for 30 years, Josephine looked back one more time at the mountains silhouetted against the starry sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to treasure. But tonight, she simply wanted to hold on to this feeling of perfect contentment, of knowing she was loved and valued and exactly where she was meant to be. Caleb opened the door and gestured her inside, his gentleman's manners still intact despite decades of rough mountain living. Josephine smiled at him, at this fierce, gentle man who had changed her entire life, and stepped across the threshold into the warmth and light. Behind her, the wilderness stretched vast and wild, but inside was everything that mattered, everything she had ever needed, everything she had ever wanted, everything she had been brave enough to fight for. This was her happily ever after, hard-won and deeply cherished, and it was more than she had ever dared to dream.